"You were never my choice," the Duke told his sickly bride until he thought he had lost her. Some wounds are inflicted by swords. Others by a single sentence. A few mornings after their wedding, the Duke looked into his new bride's eyes and quietly said, "You were never my choice." He believed those words would end the conversation. Instead, they became the greatest mistake of his life. Because the quiet, sickly woman he dismissed was hiding a strength no one had ever bothered to see. And by the time he realized who Eleanor truly was, she was already gone forever. Chapter 1. Do not look for affection where there is none, madam. You were never my choice. The words fell into the cold morning air of Thornwall Manor like stones dropped into still water. They sank, and the silence after them was worse than the words themselves. Eleanor Voss, now Eleanor Hartwell by the signatures on a marriage register, stood at the window of the Duchess's chamber in a white dressing gown that was slightly too large for her slight frame. Outside, the grounds of Thornwall stretched away in grey November light, frost still clinging to the hedgerows, a carriage waiting on the gravel drive below with its horses breathing white clouds into the cold. She had not yet turned around. She was looking at the frost. She turned now. The Duke of Thornwall was already in his travelling coat. James Hartwell, the 6th Duke of Thornwall, was the sort of man who filled a room simply by being in it, not through noise or performance, but through the sheer organized authority of his presence. He was tall, dark-haired, broad across the shoulders in a way that his excellently cut coat only made more apparent. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were the precise grey of winter sky just before rain, and they were looking at Eleanor now with a cold that she recognized was not indifference but something much more deliberate than that. Something constructed. She had noticed that last night. She had noticed quite a lot last night, in the brief hours between the ceremony and this cold morning, and she had spent those hours thinking carefully about what she noticed and what it meant. "I am aware," she said. Her voice was quiet. It always was. Eleanor had been told her whole life that she was quiet, pale, frail, prone to chills and fevers and the kind of delicate constitution that made people speak about her in lowered voices as though she were already halfway to an early grave. The Dowager Duchess of Thornwall, James's mother, Lady Constance, had spent the entire wedding breakfast the previous day referring to Eleanor as the poor dear, with a warmth that contained, on close inspection, not a single degree of actual warmth. She had married Eleanor to her son for 2 reasons: the Voss fortune, which was enormous and which Eleanor's elderly father had attached entirely to her marriage prospects, and the Voss land in the north, which shared a border with the Thornwall estate in a way that made combining them an extraordinary financial proposition. Eleanor had known this going in. She had not been deceived about the nature of the arrangement. Her father was dying, and he had secured her future in the only way available to a man of his generation and his convictions, by attaching it to a title. She had thought she could manage it. She had, genuinely, thought she could be practical about the whole thing. She had not quite accounted for James Hartwell. "I will be in London," he continued, pulling on his gloves with the precise movements of a man who had rehearsed this departure in his head. "The estate staff will attend to your needs. You will lack for nothing material. I ask only that you not interfere with the running of the house, and that you maintain appropriate appearances when required for correspondence with my solicitors." "Correspondence," Eleanor repeated. "Yes." He fastened the last button of his glove. "You need not expect visits. I will fulfill the legal obligations of this marriage as duty demands, but I will not pretend to a connection that does not exist. I think that is kinder, ultimately, than false performance." He said the word kinder with such complete conviction that Eleanor understood he believed it. That was the most interesting thing about him, she had decided. He believed everything he said at the moment he said it. He had no idea that he was lying to himself. She had noticed it the moment he walked into her father's drawing room 3 weeks ago for the formal introduction. He had been correct and distant and entirely unreadable, and then she had said something slightly sharp about the particular hypocrisy of estate entailment laws, and something had moved across his face so quickly she almost missed it. Amusement. Real, involuntary, quickly buried amusement. She had watched him bury it. She had found it very telling. She had watched him last night, too, when he thought she was not looking. The way his eyes moved when she entered a room. The particular quality of his stillness when she stood close. These were not the behaviors of a man who felt nothing. They were the behaviors of a man who had decided to feel nothing, which was an entirely different problem. Now she looked at him across the Duchess's chamber while he stood in his traveling coat with his bags already loaded and his mother's victory settled comfortably around the whole estate like a smell, and she made her own decision. She would not beg. She would not argue. She would not perform the distress he was bracing himself to manage. She was not, whatever Lady Constance believed, a fragile thing that needed managing. Very well, she said. He paused. He had expected something else. She could see it in the fractional shift of his shoulders, the brief recalibration of a man whose prepared script had just been handed back to him unused. The estate is yours to manage as you see fit, she continued pleasantly, folding her hands in front of her with the composure of a woman who had been practicing composure since she was 8 years old. I will not interfere. I hope London suits you, Your Grace. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Something moved in those winter-grey eyes. She could not name it precisely. It was the look of a man standing at the edge of something and choosing, deliberately, to step back. Then he nodded, turned, and walked out. Eleanor listened to his boots on the corridor stairs, steady and unhurried. She listened to the front doors, the crunch of gravel, the efficient sounds of a well-organized departure. She watched from the window as the carriage rolled down the drive and through the iron gates and disappeared into the grey November morning. She stood there for a while after it was gone. Then she went to the writing desk, sat down, and wrote a letter to Dr. Ambrose Finch, the Voss family physician, who had been attending her since she was 12 years old and who was the only man on earth she trusted completely. The letter said, I need your help. Come when you can. I have a plan. She sealed it, rang for the footman, and sent it before breakfast. Downstairs, she could hear Lady Constance calling for her morning tea. Chapter 2. London in winter suited James Hartwell very well, which was to say it suited the version of himself he was currently maintaining, which was the version that had no room for anything that could not be managed by a ledger or resolved by a vote in the House of Lords. He threw himself into both with considerable dedication. There were estate accounts to review, and he reviewed them thoroughly, sometimes twice. There were political meetings, committee sessions, long dinners with men of influence where the conversation was predictably tedious but reliably uncomplicated. There were invitations to every significant event of the season, which he accepted in a spirit of duty and attended in a spirit of determined social performance, and which had the useful effect of filling every hour that might otherwise produce the kind of quiet in which a man was forced to think. He was very careful not to think. His London townhouse was managed by a staff of 12 who were exceptionally good at their jobs and who had learned, in the first week, not to mention Thornwall unless directly asked. His secretary, Mr. Graves, sorted the correspondence each morning, and James had given specific instructions regarding letters from the country estate, which were to be filed without comment and brought to his attention only if they concerned structural damage or legal emergency. There were letters. He did not open them. He told himself this was appropriate and measured and that there was nothing in them he needed to know, which he believed completely, except on the occasions when he found himself briefly wondering what her handwriting looked like and whether she wrote in the careful, composed way she spoke, and then he found something else to do immediately and the wondering stopped. He attended a ball in December hosted by Lady Fairwick, who was the most dedicated social gatherer in London and who had the particular gift of assembling rooms full of people who were all, somehow, exactly who you did not want to see. He stood near the windows with a glass of untouched champagne and allowed himself to be approached by a succession of people who wanted to discuss politics, property, or his continued eligibility, the last of which always required him to explain, with patient and inflexible politeness, that he was in fact married. This information never failed to produce a ripple of surprise. He was aware that Lady Constance had been quietly circulating a version of events in which the marriage was informal, provisional, or otherwise temporary, and he was also aware that confronting his mother about this would require a conversation he was not currently willing to have. He had not visited Thornwall since November. It was now February. At the Fairwick ball, a woman he did not know well caught his attention briefly, not because she was remarkable, but because she was laughing at something and tilted her head sideways when she did it, and the movement produced in James a sudden, sharp, completely inexplicable image of Eleanor at the breakfast table at Thornwall on the morning of his departure. He had passed through the dining room briefly, collecting his hat, and she had been sitting with a book and a cup of tea, very still, not performing anything, just reading, and she had looked up when he passed and said nothing and looked back down, and he had not thought about it since. He thought about it now, for approximately 4 seconds. Then he set down the champagne and went to find his coat. In his carriage on the way home, something was wrong in his chest, a tightness that he identified as fatigue from the late hour and dismissed accordingly. It was nothing. He was tired. He had been working extremely hard. He worked harder the following week. He accepted 3 more committee appointments. He organized his library, which had not required organization. He wrote a very thorough letter to his solicitor regarding the Northern land management, and then wrote a second letter correcting several points in the first. He went to his club and played cards until midnight with men who were happy to be silent except for the business at hand. He did not open the letters from Thornwall. March arrived. Then April. Then the first warm week of May, when London smelled of horses and blossoms and the park filled up in the afternoons and the season accelerated into its full fashionable momentum, and James sat in his study at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning looking at the closed file of unread Thornwall correspondence and experienced, for the first time in 6 months, something he could not immediately organize into a category. It was a feeling without logic attached to it. A heaviness. A sense, absurd and irritating and completely resistant to dismissal, that he had done something he could not undo and that time was moving in a direction he had not authorized. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the street below, which was perfectly ordinary and entirely unhelpful. He went to the file. The letters were neatly stacked, 9 of them, all in the same hand, and the hand was exactly as he would have expected, clear, small, carefully formed, and completely composed. He did not read them in order. He picked up the one at the bottom, which was dated January, and unfolded it. Your Grace, I write to inform you that the east wing roof has been assessed by the local builder and will require attention before winter. I have taken the liberty of commissioning the repair, as waiting for correspondence to travel to London and return would allow further deterioration. I trust this falls within the scope of household management you assigned to me. The cost has been recorded in the estate accounts. He read it twice. There was no reproach in it. There was no performance of suffering or patience. It was exactly what it presented itself as, a practical update, written by a woman who was managing his house sensibly and asking nothing from him. He picked up another. Your Grace, the head gardener, Mr. Hobbs, has retired. I have appointed his assistant, Tom Cray, in his place after 3 months of observation. Tom has good instincts and the staff respect him. I think you will be satisfied. He read them all. It took 40 minutes. None of them asked for anything. None of them complained. None of them were written with the trembling hand of a frail woman declining quietly in a cold manor house. They were confident, clear, and occasionally in very small doses, brief and quickly contained, faintly dry, in a way that reminded him sharply and uncomfortably of something she had said in her father's drawing room about entailment laws. He sat for a long time after he finished reading. Then he went to tell his valet to pack his trunks for Thornwall. Chapter 3. He could see the gates from the road. They were draped in black. James's carriage was still moving when he saw it, and something happened in his chest that was not the tightness he had been cataloguing for months. This was different. This was a cold, dropping sensation, the kind that begins somewhere behind the sternum and falls without stopping. He pressed his hand flat against the carriage window and stared at the black silk moving gently in the May breeze as the iron gates approached. The carriage turned in through the gates. The gravel drive was the same. The hedgerows were the same. The house rose up at the end of the drive exactly as it always had, grey stone and tall windows and the solid permanence of a building that had survived several centuries and saw no reason to be impressed by any given decade. But the front door had a black wreath on it. James was out of the carriage before it fully stopped. He took the front steps in too and pushed through the door into the entrance hall, and the entrance hall was cold in a way it had not been in November, and the black draping continued inside, along the banister of the staircase, framing the portrait gallery. His mother was in the drawing room. Lady Constance Hartwell, the Dowager Duchess of Thornwall, was seated in the best chair by the fire with a cup of tea and the satisfied composure of a woman whose morning was proceeding as planned. She looked up when he entered. Her expression was the expression she wore when things were going the way she had intended them to go, which James had always found infuriating, but which now produced something more complex and considerably darker than irritation. "James." She set down the teacup. "I did not expect you until later in the week. What has happened?" He heard his own voice, which was strange, lower than he expected and stripped of the controlled distance he had been maintaining for months. "The gates. The door. What has happened?" His mother regarded him with the particular serenity of someone delivering news they had already processed thoroughly and made their peace with. "Your wife's heart, I am afraid. It was always fragile. The physicians had warned of it for years, as you know." She lifted the teacup again. "She passed away 3 weeks ago. I am sorry you were not here, though of course arrangements have been made. The funeral was very appropriate." The room went quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a country house on a May morning, but a different kind, the kind that arrives when something that has been moving in a particular direction for a very long time stops entirely. James stood in the doorway of his drawing room and heard his mother say that Eleanor was dead, and felt the precise moment that 6 months of careful, deliberate containment collapsed. It did not collapse slowly. There was no gradual fracture, no widening crack, no warning. It simply went, all at once, the way a wall goes when the foundation underneath it fails, dropping everything that had been stacked on top of it directly onto the ground. What came flooding in was not one thing but many things arriving simultaneously, and the force of it was staggering. The guilt arrived first, specific and sharp and without mercy, latching directly onto the memory of that morning in November, her face at the window, the white dressing gown, the composure he had mistaken at the time for coldness and now understood, terribly and too late, was the composure of someone who had been practicing not to break. Then the loss arrived, which was different from grief and worse, because it was weighted with the knowledge of what he had refused to know. Every letter he had not opened for 6 months sat in his chest now like a separate stone. Every day he had spent in London filling his hours to avoid the quiet in which he might have had to think about her. And underneath all of it, the thing he had been most ruthlessly refusing to know, which was that he had thought about her constantly. Not consciously. Not in any way he would have admitted or had the language to name while he was in the middle of it. But she had been there, in the margins of every day, in the involuntary image that surfaced when a woman laughed and tilted her head, in the tightness in his chest on Tuesday mornings in May. He had spent 6 months burying something that had not been suppressible, only deferred. And now it was too late. 3 weeks ago, he said. His voice did not sound like his own. Yes. I managed everything. Lady Constance set down the teacup with a precise, small click. It was very sad, of course. Poor dear. He turned and walked out of the drawing room. He climbed the stairs. He walked down the corridor past the portrait gallery, past his own chamber door, to the end of the east hall where the Duchess's rooms were. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was neat and still. Her things were still there, books on the writing desk, a pair of gloves on the dressing table, a shawl folded over the back of the chair by the window. The window where she had stood that November morning in the too large dressing gown, looking at the frost. James crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside that window, because his legs had made the decision for him, and he put his hands on his knees and looked at the frost in May, which was not there, because it was May, but which he saw anyway. He stayed there for a very long time. At some point he became aware that he was not a man who knew how to grieve, having spent his adult life ensuring he would not need to, and that this was the most complete and deserved failure of that strategy that he could possibly have arrived at. He had called her sickly. He had called her a convenience. He had stood in this very room and told her she was never his choice, and she had looked at him with those clear, intelligent eyes and said, "I am aware," and he had mistaken the absence of collapse for the absence of feeling, and he had left. The regret was not a wave. It was a weight. It sat on his chest in that empty room like something permanent, and he understood with absolute clarity that it was going to be permanent. He had earned it completely. He did not go back downstairs. Chapter 4. 300 miles away, on the morning of the same Tuesday in May, Eleanor Hartwell was standing at the window of a whitewashed building above a harbor in the coastal town of Aldermere, watching fishing boats rock on the bright green water below and drinking the best tea she had made in her life. She had been making good tea for 7 months. The room behind her was small and practical and entirely hers, which was still, after 7 months, the most striking thing about it. No dowager duchess appearing in doorways. No husband's carriage rolling down the drive to remind her of her own redundancy. No staff casting careful sideways glances because they were uncertain whose instructions to follow. Just the room, the harbor, the boats, and the tea. She looked well. This was not a small thing. Eleanor had been looked at with concern and sympathy and careful lowered voice worry for so much of her life that the absence of those looks still surprised her when she caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked healthy, genuinely and undeniably so, the color in her face full and permanent rather than the occasional flush that had been her best performance at Thornwall. Her appetite was good. She slept without the restless, shallow anxiety that had plagued her in the manor house. She had put on weight in a way that her tailored new dresses acknowledged straightforwardly and cheerfully, and she had bought those dresses in colors she had never been permitted to wear as the poor dear daughter of Lord Voss, who needed to conserve her energy and not excite herself. She was, in other words, entirely fine. She was, more specifically, flourishing. The plan had come together over 3 months of careful correspondence with Dr. Finch, who had attended her since childhood and who had, upon reading her first letter, written back a response that said, in its entirety, "I understand. I am coming. Burn this letter." He had arrived at Thornwall Inn. December with his medical bag and his complete discretion and a talent for theatrical management that Eleanor had not previously been aware of and was deeply grateful for. The decline had been gradual and convincing. Dr. Finch had managed the symptoms with the sorrowful authority of a physician delivering difficult news he had expected for years. The household staff, most of whom liked Eleanor and none of whom liked the dowager, were grieved but unsurprised. Lady Constance had accepted the news with a composure that told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how much the Dowager Duchess valued her daughter-in-law's existence versus the fortune that had already been legally transferred on the wedding night. Eleanor had slipped out of Thornwall at 2 a.m. in a cart driven by Dr. Finch, who had later returned to stage her fake funeral, with a bag of clothing, her mother's pearl earrings, a significant amount of her own private savings that she had been quietly managing since her father died, and the comprehensive freedom of a woman whom society believed was no longer alive to inconvenience it. She had come to Aldermere because it was Dr. Finch's suggestion, because it was far enough from London to be invisible and close enough to the shipping routes to be useful, and because a widow in a coastal trading town was the least remarkable thing in the world. The Sapphire Widow, which was what people in Aldermere had started calling the mysterious entrepreneur who had set up in the old harbour building and quietly begun revolutionizing the town's textile import trade, was considerably more remarkable, but she was also anonymous enough that remarkable was acceptable. Eleanor had spent her girlhood reading her father's business correspondence over his shoulder while he pretended not to notice, filing everything away in a mind that was sharper and more retentive than anyone around her had found convenient to acknowledge. She had grown up watching money move, understanding where it stuck and where it flowed and why, and she had found, upon applying this understanding to the Aldermere textile situation, which involved several inefficiencies that were both obvious and easily resolved, that she was very good at this. She had a staff of 4, a harbour manager named Giles who had been skeptical for approximately 3 weeks and devoted ever since, a bookkeeper named Mrs. Crane who was 60 years old and had a memory like a steel trap, a shipping negotiator named Patrick who was 24 and alarmingly talented, and Dr. Finch himself, who had retired to Aldermere with her and managed her continued appearance of excellent health with the quiet satisfaction of a man who felt he had done something genuinely worthwhile with his career. Her life was orderly, purposeful, and completely satisfying. She tried not to think about James. She was not always successful at this, which she considered fair. She had been attracted to him since the drawing room in November, in the way one was attracted to a locked door, with the particular frustrated curiosity of knowing that whatever was behind it was worth the effort. She had watched him bury himself alive in his own pride and felt the specific sadness of watching someone make a terrible mistake in slow motion. She did not regret leaving. She would not have survived Thornwall, not physically, because the stress of Lady Constance and the cold neglect of a husband who refused to know himself would have done precisely what everyone expected her health to do, and not emotionally, because she was Eleanor Voss and she had not come this far to be someone's convenient fortune in a cold manor house. She had made the right choice. She was absolutely sure of it. She finished her tea, set down the cup, and went downstairs to her office, because a new shipment of Flemish wool had arrived the day before and there were accounts to examine, and the Sapphire Widow had work to do. Chapter 5. The Duke of Thornwall arrived in Aldermere on a grey Thursday morning in April, 11 months after Eleanor had left. He looked like a man who had been through something. He had, as a matter of fact, been through quite a lot. After the night on the floor of the Duchess's chamber at Thornwall, which had extended into a day and a night and another morning before he finally stood up and washed his face and went back downstairs with the slightly simplified expression of a man who had arrived at a very painful clarity, he had done 3 things in quick succession. He had called his solicitor and stripped his mother of every legal authority she held over Thornwall estate and his household. He had called his mother into the library and told her, in clear and moderate language that left no room for interpretation, that her management of his marriage, of his household, and of the people in it had come to its permanent end. Lady Constance had produced several arguments, all of which he listened to without responding to, and then he had asked her to leave for the Dower House. She had left. Then he had attempted to grieve, which was a thing he was not built for and had no practice in, and which he had done badly and alone in the wrong city for several months, before his solicitor had mentioned, almost in passing, that there was a highly successful textile import operation in Aldermere run by an entrepreneur of considerable business intelligence whose methods he thought might interest the Duke from an investment perspective, given his northern estate's wool production. James had not particularly wanted to think about textiles. But he had not slept properly in 11 months, and he needed something to do with his hands that was not sitting in his townhouse feeling the weight of irreversible errors, and Aldermere was far away, which was itself a recommendation. He had not expected the office above the harbour. He had not expected the mahogany desk. He had absolutely not expected, in any version of any future he had been capable of imagining during the 11 months since the black-draped gates, the woman sitting behind that desk. She was in a deep blue velvet gown, fitted and confident, with her hair pinned up and a ledger open in front of her and a pen in her hand, and she looked up when his escort opened the door, and the expression on her face was the most controlled thing he had ever seen in his life, which was saying something, because he had spent a great deal of his life in rooms with people who were performing control. More than that, he was shocked beyond words. Was he seeing a ghost? Well, she was a really gorgeous ghost. How was this even possible? She had died 11 months ago. Ah, said Eleanor Hartwell, the woman he had thought long buried, said, setting down her pen with perfect steadiness. Your Grace. Sit down. The door closed behind him. James did not sit down. He stood in the doorway of her office and looked at her for what felt like a very long time and was probably 4 seconds, and then his legs made the decision they had made once before in this particular context, except this time there was no floor to sit on, there was only the ground in front of her desk, and that was where he ended up. On his knees. Eleanor. His voice came out in a way he did not plan and would not have chosen. Eleanor, how's this even possible? I can't believe this, I need you to know. Your Grace. Her voice was pleasant and even and held behind it something that he recognized, with a start, as the same quality of control he had seen in the Duchess's chamber at Thornwall, not coldness, never coldness, but something built over something else, with great care and considerable effort. You are alive, he said, which was not what he had intended to start with but was the most pressing fact in the room. I am, she agreed. Sit in the chair, James. Not on the floor. It does not help either of us. He stood up. He sat in the chair. He put his hands on his knees and looked at her across the mahogany desk, and she looked back at him with the clear, intelligent eyes that he had spent 11 months wishing he had looked at more carefully when he had the opportunity. You staged it, he said. Yes. The decline. He stopped. Finch. Dr. Finch was very helpful. She folded her hands on the desk. He has always prioritized my actual health over other people's expectations of it, which puts him in a small and distinguished category. James was quiet for a moment. He was assembling something, fitting pieces together, and the picture they made was not comfortable. You were not dying, he said slowly. You were never dying. The frailty was real enough, in context. Her voice was precise. Stress, James. Sustained, unrelenting stress is a remarkable thing. The Dowager Duchess in my doorway every morning with her quiet management. A husband who told me I was never his choice and left me in a cold house to be managed like an inconvenient piece of furniture. She paused. Not cruelly. Simply accurately. In that house, my health was genuinely fragile. Here, as you can see, it is not. He could see. He could see it very clearly, the color in her face, the directness of her posture, the absolute evidence of a woman who had taken her life back from something that was slowly compressing it into nothing. He had not known what she looked like when she was not in that house. He had never had the opportunity to know. He had not given himself the opportunity. He reached into his coat and found nothing useful there, no prepared statement, no organized argument, no managed distance to retreat behind. He had left all of that on the floor of the Duchess's chamber in May. I thought you were dead, he said. The words came out stripped of everything except what they were. For 11 months. I thought you were dead. I sat in your room and I understood, in the most complete way I have ever understood anything, exactly what I had done and what I had lost, and I do not have the right to say any of this to you. No, she agreed quietly. You don't. I know. He held her gaze. You told me you were aware. When I said those words to you, you said I am aware, and I thought you were simply accepting the situation, and I have thought about that moment with considerable shame since May, because I understand now what you meant. You were aware that I was lying. You were more aware of what was happening between us than I was willing to be. He paused. And I left anyway. Eleanor was very still. You told me I was never your choice, she said. I took you at your word and chose myself. The words were steady, but something in her jaw was not, some small movement of muscle that she controlled before he could be certain he had seen it. I do not regret it. I want to be completely clear about that. I do not regret leaving. I do not regret this life, or this office, or any single morning of the past 11 months. Good, he said, and meant it, which surprised him slightly. She looked at him. You mean that? Yes. He leaned forward in the chair. Eleanor, I am not here to ask you to give this up. I am not here to tell you your life is incomplete without Thornwall or without me. I was wrong about so many things, but I am not wrong enough to walk in here and suggest that what you have built is less important than what you left behind. He held her gaze. I am here because I am a man who made every wrong choice available to him and arrived at a complete understanding of that in an empty room in May, and because I cannot go back and undo any of it, but I am also not willing to spend the rest of my life simply carrying the weight of it alone without having at least told you the truth once. And what is the truth? That I have been in love with you, he said, since you said something impertinent about entailment laws in your father's drawing room, and I spent 6 months doing extraordinary amounts of paperwork to avoid knowing it. The harbor outside the window was doing its usual things, light on water, the cry of gulls, the deep sound of a ship coming in. Eleanor sat behind her mahogany desk and looked at the Duke of Thornwall, who had dropped to his knees on her floor and then sat in her chair and told her the truth with the absolute simplicity of a man who had run out of other options, and her heart, which she had spent 11 months firmly instructing to behave itself, was not behaving. She had been attracted to him since November. She knew herself well enough to have been honest about that, at least in private. She knew the particular quality of his stillness when he was paying attention, and the involuntary amusement he could not fully suppress when something genuinely surprised him, and the way he had held her letters for months and then read them all in 40 minutes, which Dr. Finch had confirmed through a careful channel of information because she was only human and she had needed to know. She was also a woman who had faked her death to escape a cold house and a controlling mother-in-law and had built a life that suited her completely, and she had not done all of that to hand it back over to a man simply because he had finally arrived at a feeling he should have arrived at 13 months ago. I am not going back to Thornwall, she said. I am not asking you to. I am not giving up the business. I would be a fool to suggest it. You have turned a failing import route into the most efficient textile operation in the South Harbor, and I have only been here for 7 minutes. She pressed her lips together. You need to understand that I will not be managed. Not by you, and absolutely not by your mother. My mother has been at the Dower House since June. She is no longer part of any conversation about my household. His voice was completely level. I handled that in May. It was overdue. Eleanor studied him. She had always been good at studying people. It was, in many ways, her most useful skill. She looked at the man in front of her and catalogued what she saw, which was not the controlled, armored presence that had walked into her father's drawing room in November, but something considerably more tired and more honest and, on close inspection, more worth looking at. You need somewhere to stay, she said. A brief pause. He had not expected the conversation to go in this direction. The harbor inn seemed adequate. It isn't. The roof leaks. She stood, smoothing her velvet skirt with the ease of a woman who had grown comfortable in her own clothes. There is a cottage 2 streets up that lets rooms to respectable tenants. I know the landlady. She will have you if I recommend you. He stood as well. You would recommend me. I am considering it. She moved to the window, looking down at the harbor, where one of her shipments was being unloaded with the efficiency she had spent 11 months building into her operation. James, I am not telling you to leave. I am also not telling you to stay. I am telling you that if you stay, there are terms. Name them. You do not rush me. She kept her eyes on the harbor. You do not assume that your acknowledgement of what you did translates immediately into my willingness to trust you. Trust is a thing that requires time and evidence, and I am an excellent judge of evidence. I know, he said. I have read your estate letters. Your standard of evidence is exceptional. She turned at that, very slightly, and he saw it, the fractional, involuntary amusement that moved across her face and was suppressed before it could become something larger. The same thing he had done in the drawing room in November. The same reflex. Something between them that had been there from the beginning and had never, despite everything, gone anywhere. I also run a business, she continued, recovering. My hours are my own. My staff report to me. My decisions are mine. Entirely. And if at any point you attempt to manage me, or condescend to me, or tell me that my opinions are interesting but perhaps better expressed in a softer. Eleanor. His voice was warm, quiet, and direct. Have I ever, in any single recorded interaction, suggested that your opinions were better expressed softly? She considered this. No, she admitted. That is one thing I cannot charge you with. Then let me stay, he said simply. Not as your husband demanding his rights. Not as the Duke of Thornwall retrieving an asset. As a man who was wrong in every available way, and who would like the opportunity to demonstrate that he is capable of being something better, if you are willing to let him try. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The harbor moved below them in the May light, green water and white birds and the sounds of a town that worked because people in it did what they were good at and were allowed to do it without being managed into smallness. There is a woman on Harbor Street named Mrs. Cord, Eleanor said. She lets the front rooms to respectable tenants and charges a fair rate and will not tolerate noise after 9 in the evening. Tell her I sent you. He nodded once. I walk to the harbor at 7 in the morning, she continued. If you happen to be walking in the same direction, I would not consider it an imposition. The corner of his mouth moved, the same involuntary thing she had been watching for since November. 7, he said. I will be sure to be awake. He found the cottage on Harbor Street that afternoon. He paid Mrs. Cord for 3 months in advance, which Mrs. Cord accepted with the no-nonsense satisfaction of a woman who appreciated a tenant who understood commitment. He was on Harbor Street at 5 minutes to 7 the following morning. So was Eleanor, in a green wool coat that suited her considerably better than anything she had worn at Thornwall, carrying a small bag of bread from the morning baker for the harbor birds, which she apparently did every day because she was, underneath the business efficiency and the composed authority, the same woman who had sent a letter to her physician and staged her own death rather than diminish herself, and who had also, at some earlier and tenderer point in her life, decided to be kind. To birds. He fell into step beside her without speaking. She did not tell him to stop. They walked to the harbor together in the early morning, and she fed the birds, and he watched, and neither of them said anything that needed saying yet, because they had time, and she had made it clear that time was the price of this, and he had spent 11 months learning the cost of being unwilling to pay for things. The months that followed moved in a rhythm he had not known before. He backed her wool shipments quietly, through channels that kept his name from her ledgers until she found out, which she did within 2 weeks because she was Eleanor and her bookkeeper was Mrs. Crane, and she came to his cottage on a Tuesday morning and stood in the doorway with the ledger in hand and told him that she ran her own accounts and did not require silent investors. He told her he was aware. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, genuine and surprised, the kind that she had not performed at all, and he understood that he had just been handed something very valuable. He accepted it carefully, the way she deserved. He waited outside the office building on the evening it rained in August, with an umbrella he had thought to bring and which she had not, and he walked her home under it without making anything of it, and they talked about the shipping contract she was renegotiating and his thoughts on the harbor development, which she had strong opinions about and which she expressed, in their entirety, without softening. He found this remarkable. He also found it, increasingly, the best part of his day. Lady Constance arrived in Aldermere on a Wednesday in September. She came in a private carriage with her lady's maid and her disapproval fully assembled, and she found her son outside Eleanor's office building at 10:30 in the morning, in a plain dark coat with no insignia, holding a parcel of papers that Eleanor had asked him to collect from the shipping agent. Lady Constance looked at him. She looked at the parcel. She looked at the building. "James," she said, in the voice that had managed rooms, households, and one very large fortune for 30 years. "This has gone on long enough. Whatever grief you are performing, it must end. There are responsibilities. There are expectations. You are the Duke of Thornwall, and you are standing on a harbour street running errands for a merchant woman who is my wife," James said. His mother stopped. He had said it simply, without drama, in the same tone he might use to note the weather. He turned to face her fully, and his expression was the one Eleanor had only recently begun to see, not the constructed, maintained, armoured distance of the man in the carriage in November, but the one underneath it, which was steadier and more certain and entirely unwilling to be moved. "Eleanor Hartwell is the Duchess of Thornwall," he said clearly. "She is alive, which I suspect you may have known was possible, and she is here, and she is running one of the most efficient import businesses on this coast, and I am honoured to stand on a harbour street and carry her paperwork." He held his mother's gaze without any of the old discomfort. "You have no authority over this marriage, over my household, or over Eleanor. That was made clear in June. I will not be clarifying it again." Around them, Harbour Street continued its morning. A fisherman went past with a cart. Two women from the cloth merchant's shop paused at a respectable distance. Mrs. Crane, who had come to the office door for morning air and stayed for the scene, observed everything with the focused attention of an excellent witness. Lady Constance stood in the September sunlight and looked at her son, and whatever she saw in his face finally told her something she had perhaps not been willing to see, which was that she had lost. She left. Eleanor was at the window when it happened. She had seen all of it. When James came in with the papers and set them on the corner of her desk, she did not say anything for a moment. She looked at him in the way she had been looking at him for weeks, carefully, assessingly, measuring something. "She will not be back," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I don't think she will be." She stood. She crossed from behind the desk, which she had not done before, and she stood in front of him in the blue velvet office on Harbour Street, and she looked at him at the distance of someone making a considered decision rather than a desperate one, which was the only distance she had ever been willing to act from. "You carried my paperwork," she said. "It seemed useful. You have been walking me to the harbour for 4 months. The birds appear to expect me now. I did not want to disappoint them." She smiled. It was real and unguarded, and it arrived in his chest like sunlight into a room that had been shuttered for a very long time. "You told me I was never your choice," she said. "In November. In that room." "Yes," he said. "I did. And now?" He looked at her with the winter-grey eyes that were not cold at all, had never been cold, had simply been a man standing at the edge of something he was too frightened to understand, and he said, in the plainest and most complete way he had ever said anything, "You are the only choice I have ever made that I am entirely sure of." Eleanor reached up and straightened the lapel of his plain dark coat, the way she might have straightened a ledger column, with the brisk precision of a woman who dealt in what was actually in front of her, and then she left her hand there. "I am not going back to Thornwall," she said. "Then we will make Aldermere home." He covered her hand with his, steady and sure. "Or wherever you choose. It is your choice, Eleanor. It has always been yours. I was just too proud to understand that." She looked up at him. "The east wing at Thornwall is finished, incidentally. I supervised the repairs by correspondence. The builder did good work." "I know. I read the letter." "Which one?" "All of them." He met her gaze. I read all 9 of them in May, before I drove to Thornwall. 40 minutes. I understand they were filed for months. They were. I am sorry. I know, she said. And then, because she was Eleanor Voss, who had always known exactly what was in a room even when the room pretended otherwise, you have been sorry since November. You were just not ready to say it. The harbour outside the window moved in the afternoon light, and Aldermere went about its business, and the Duchess of Thornwall stood in her office on Harbour Street and looked at the man who had finally, at considerable cost and with no guarantee of anything, arrived at the truth of himself. She thought he was worth it. She decided to let him know. If you rejoiced when the Duke finally threw down his pride to protect his hidden Duchess, you will absolutely love the story of how a forgotten sister stood up against the entire ton to shield her family and utterly captured a cold, unyielding Duke's heart along the way. Watch her legendary triumph right here.